Because we have a full program, and I'd like to, thanks. I'm Elizabeth Donahue. I'm the Assistant Dean for Public and External Affairs here at the Woodrow Wilson School. Thank you for coming to our latest up-to-the-minute event. As many of you know, we try to host these events to reflect what's going on in our world, and we're very happy that our four speakers were able to come and join us. Really, it was a very last-minute request, so thank you to all of you. For today, we're going to hear first from Anne Marie Slaughter. She is the former Director of Policy Planning for the U.S. Department of State. She is the Bert G. Kerstetter 66 University of Professor of Politics and International Affairs. We like to have very short titles here at the Woodrow Wilson School. And she was the former Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. And she will discuss U.S. diplomacy efforts and relations with other countries in the Arab world, particularly Pakistan and Afghanistan, in light of what's happened with the killing of bin Laden. Next, we will hear from Jacob Shapiro. Professor Shapiro is an assistant professor of politics and international affairs, and he co-directs the Empirical Studies of Conflict project, which examines the relationship between terrorism, governance, and development. He will discuss the implications for Al-Qaeda, as well as the implications for politics in Pakistan. And then we'll hear from Nolan McCarty, who's our current Associate Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School and the Susan Dodd Brown Professor of Politics and Public Affairs. And he will discuss the domestic political ramifications of what has gone on in the last few weeks. And finally, we'll hear from Lieutenant Commander Kevin Cady, who is a current Wilson School Master's student in our mid-career program, as well as a Navy SEAL. He's had 13 years in the U.S. Navy, which has included 6 deployments, 4 to Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, 1 to the Far East, and 1 to South America. And he will provide context regarding the efforts of the Navy SEALs in the efforts in the last few weeks. So thank you very much.
I think actually I'll do this from here, since we're going to make this a panel discussion and have lots of Q&A. So first of all, it's nice to see everybody and nice to be back. This is, I think, particularly nice to have these kinds of panels and have a chance to discuss things that are happening now, both with students and the community. I want to talk about what happened last Sunday night and where we're going in the context of 3 distinct and quite different images. The first is the image that was written about by a former soldier who had been in Afghanistan several times, who wrote the day after Osama bin Laden was killed that this meant that Afghanistan would not be a forgotten war, that so often many of the soldiers deployed felt that they were working at building a nation in a Mad Max wasteland. For those of you who have seen the movie Mad Max, it is a very bleak image of trying to build basic institutions in a very lawless world. It is that image that is in Restrepo, this vision of extremely hard conditions where our military are trying simultaneously to win the hearts and minds of villagers while fighting a very deadly enemy. So that's the first image. The second is the image of the Navy SEALs capturing or killing bin Laden within the compound in Pakistan. So 2 points. One, the incredible preparation, the intelligence, the support for these extraordinarily well-trained young men. And second, the fact that it was not in Afghanistan, it was in Pakistan. The third image doesn't take place in either Afghanistan or Pakistan, although I wish it would. It is the image of Egyptians, Tunisians, Libyans, Bahrainis, Syrians, Yemenis, young people facing bullets, facing brutality, facing extraordinary conditions to try to take back their governments, to demand governments that provide basic services and opportunities for their citizens. So with those three images in mind, I want to push on each of them, what I think their significance is and how they fit together and how they don't fit together. So the first image, I commend to you Bing West's most recent book, like the documentary Restrepo. It spent a lot of time with our troops in Afghanistan. The first question is, well, why are our troops in these incredibly harsh circumstances, in very remote valleys often, or in the mountains, fighting the Taliban? And the first thing to say is they're there because when we tried a strategy that only focused on Al-Qaeda, that only focused on counterterrorism, the result was the Taliban were coming back in force. In other words, when we had the strategy that many are advocating for today, which says, forget about the villagers, forget about clear, hold, and build, let us only do what is necessary to go after terrorist networks who are directly threatening us, we tried that. We tried that for 4 or 5 years. The result was the Afghan people thought, these people don't care about us. They're only here for their own purposes. We were unable to get the intelligence we needed, and the Taliban were steadily gaining ground to the point that we were afraid they were once again going to seize Kabul, and then we were going to be right back where we started, with a government that would host Al-Qaeda in ways that gave it free rein to fight against us. So that's the first point. That's why we're there. We had to change our strategy, and the strategy that we shifted to was a counterinsurgency strategy that has, in fact, pushed back the Taliban in lots of different places, although it is very, very hard to do. It doesn't work without a lot of U.S. soldiers, and I would say it's unlikely to work as long as the Taliban, as long as Afghan villagers know we're going to leave. Because the theory of counterinsurgency is that we go in, we clear the Taliban out, we help villagers rebuild their lives, we gain their confidence, they give us the intelligence we need to push the Taliban back further, and also to be able to attack Al-Qaeda more directly. Now, as long as these villagers don't think we're going to stay, they have no incentive to give us a lot of the intelligence we need. Just think about it. You're there, you've got two forces. You may much prefer the Americans, but you know the Taliban are going to be there as long as you are, and when the Americans leave, they are likely to take revenge. So what's happened in many of these villages is we're not getting the intelligence we need, and we do have our troops in very, very dangerous conditions. So where does that mean we go from here? Well, one, I do think we should recognize we have made a lot of progress pushing the Taliban back. And we are now in a far better position than we were 2 years ago to be able to enter into negotiations in which the Taliban have incentives to compromise, as does the Karzai government. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So then turn to the second image, where, as we've read infinitely over the past week, Osama bin Laden was not in a cave on the Afghan-Pakistan border. He was in Abbottabad, about a couple hours outside of Islamabad. He was essentially next to the Pakistani version of West Point. And we were ultimately able to kill him, not with our soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan, but with special forces, through a combination of a tremendous intelligence work over a long time and special forces, somewhat ironically, exactly the lighter footprint that Donald Rumsfeld argued for when he first came in as Secretary of Defense. He decided to demonstrate the virtue of that lighter footprint in Iraq. I don't think that worked out so well, but in many ways, looking at what we were able to do last Sunday does suggest we're going to be more effective against many of our enemies using special forces in various ways with a lot of intelligence than traditional warfare. That then raises all the questions about Pakistan. The first thing to say is, so did the Pakistanis know? Well, the idea that there is something called the Pakistanis is silly, Right? J. Edgar Hoover did a whole lot of stuff that we're still finding out about in some cases, right? That the other parts of our government did not know about. That is hardly uncommon. So the idea that some members of either the ISI or other parts of the Pakistani government knew, I'm quite willing to believe somebody knew. Indeed, Secretary Clinton said a year ago when she went to Pakistan, she said she believed that some parts of the Pakistani government knew. But I'm equally willing to believe that other parts did not know. It is very unlikely that the military would have wanted to be shown up as being either duplicitous or incompetent. That's the position the Pakistani military is in right now. They either knew and they were lying to us, or they didn't know, and he was right there, and they are supposed to be one of the most strongest and most effective institutions in Pakistan. They're looking very bad at the moment to the Pakistani people. And similarly, President Karzai, do we really think President Karzai knew that Osama bin Laden was sitting there in Abbottabad? So I think the first issue is I don't know if we'll ever know, but the idea that Pakistan knew is not a helpful way even to think about it. Second, though, we have known, of course, that there are elements of the Pakistani government who are not shall we say, on the same page as we are with respect to Al-Qaeda, but I think even more importantly with respect to the Taliban whom we are fighting in Afghanistan. There is more and more evidence of certain elements of the ISI directly working very closely with the very Afghan Taliban whom we are fighting. So we are in this very difficult situation in which we are funding a country, we are working with a country, we're getting lots of intelligence from a country where other parts of that same government is actively fighting on the other side. And when I say fighting, I mean shooting American soldiers. So that's a very complicated relationship. Where do we go from here? We don't have the option, really, of just pulling out and walking away. We have tried that before. It was disastrous. One of the reasons we have such a difficult relationship with Pakistan is that we had a very good relationship with their army. We cut all that off. We withdrew all military engagement, education, support, training through the Presser Amendment because of Pakistan's nuclear program, effectively leaving them to whoever they could get support from. We then came back, of course, during the end of the war in the 1990s when the Afghans were still fighting the Russians, and we've done that several times. So Pakistan essentially doesn't trust us. A large part of what Ambassador Holbrooke was trying to do when he was still alive was to convince the Pakistanis that we are really there for the long haul, that we understand their security interests, our security interests. 31,000 Pakistanis, 31,000, that's a lot of people, have died from the same terrorist attacks that we are fighting. So we have to be there, and we have to engage with Pakistan, but we have to engage with Pakistan in ways that strengthen the parts of the government who actually do work with us and weaken those that do not. Easy to say, very hard to do. There again, let me come back to what I said about the time for a political settlement. I think this is a moment where, for a number of reasons, there's a better chance of getting a political settlement to end the war in Afghanistan than there has been for a long time. From our purposes, obviously, the American people are saying, look at what just happened. Why are we in Afghanistan? We were already planning to draw down. This is now a moment. I testified before the Senate a week ago. Senators right and left were basically saying this is costing us $120 billion a year, and why? So it's a moment for the U.S. to reassess. It's a moment for the Taliban to possibly have greater freedom to negotiate because Osama bin Laden is dead. So that tie between Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden is weaker between the other members of Al-Qaeda and members of the Taliban. And as I just said, there are very good reasons at the moment for the Pakistanis, who are looking very embarrassed, to be more willing to let the members of the Taliban negotiate than they had been. Might not work, but it's the moment where there are openings. It's the political job to push very hard to see if we can't get a settlement that will allow us to withdraw, but will also allow us to create a regional agreement that will help stabilize Pakistan and Afghanistan, and also in even focusing on India, which we can talk about in the question period. Third image that I gave you was really, to me, the far more important image, rather than as powerful as killing Osama bin Laden was. That's the past. It can still be the present, the next attack. I'm not saying Al-Qaeda doesn't matter, but the most important thing that I have seen in the Muslim world, including the development of Al-Qaeda, is unquestionably what we're watching across these countries. We have known for at least a decade this was coming. I can't tell you how many papers I've seen that talked about the youth bulge in these countries. 60% of the population of the Middle East and North Africa is under 30. 60%. Did we really expect that all these young people who don't have jobs, but many of whom are well educated and who can see how others live, we're just going to take it forever? They are fighting. That's frankly what we want to see in Pakistan and Afghanistan. I would give anything to see the Pakistanis rise up in the same way against the hideous corruption of many parts of their government, ditto in Afghanistan. And the best thing that we can do is to do everything we can to help that succeed in Libya, in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Syria. It's not so easy. There's some things we can do and there's others we can't. But I'd like to leave you with that thought, that ultimately, to the extent those revolutions succeed, and succeed means just getting a more decent government and the prospect of meaningful reform over time, that fact will have a greater impact on the future of Afghanistan and Pakistan than anything else we can do. Thank you.
So I'll kind of start my remarks by trying to pick up on Anne-Marie's note of hopefulness and try and flesh it out a little bit with respect to what's likely to happen in Pakistani politics. And this is really critical for a number of reasons, I think one of which Anne-Marie highlighted is that the Taliban, I think most people would agree, is not going to be able to do anything with respect to changing its strategy in Afghanistan without the approval of lots of powerful people in Pakistan. And so to the extent that we're hoping for a negotiated settlement in Afghanistan and a durable, stable situation in Afghanistan, the road to that runs in large part through Islamabad. And so what are the effects of this likely to be for Pakistani politics? Well, I think it's extremely hopeful in a number of ways. So the first is that there are a number of kind of myths that people like to talk about or kind of tell themselves in Pakistani politics that come under extreme scrutiny because of this incident. So the first is that the ISI is a competent intelligence organization. So there are two elements of this that are really devastating to that viewpoint. So the first is that the CIA built, seems pretty clear now, over a number of years, its own intelligence network inside Pakistan, which the ISI didn't know about or couldn't track to the point where they were able to establish a safe house with a line of sight into Osama bin Laden's house and staff it for several months without being noticed. So that's kind of striking. The second is that bin Laden was in one house for 6 years. Now, why is this so odd? Well, it turns out the main way the Pakistani government collects taxes is through property taxes. And houses are supposed to be assessed when built, when additions are made, or every 5 years at the latest. And the way the assessment happens is the tax assessor shows up with a constable who can gain access to the house by law. You kind of have to let them in. And so to the extent that this happens in kind of most parts of Pakistan fairly regularly, it happens in military housing areas, which is where this house was, much more often and kind of with greater regularity. So this really begs the question, if this house was being evaluated for covered footage, basically how much territory does the roof cover, which requires going into the house, not just looking at the guardhouse, how did no one notice this? Or how did at least no one who deals with and debriefs the tax assessors pick up on the fact that there was something a little weird going on there? So again, that's hard to square with the vision of the ISI as a competent intelligence agency. The second thing it kind of puts the lie to is the idea that the Pakistani military is an extremely competent defender of the nation's territory, right? So there was, over a series of days after the attack, kind of all these conflicting stories about how the American helicopters were able to make it in and out without being noticed. And so first the story was, well, we knew about them, but we couldn't get the jets up in time. Then the story became, well, we didn't have our radars turned on facing west because they're really expensive to maintain, and so we don't want to use them too much. And then the story became today, well, it's true the Americans have the ability to evade our radar, but if anyone tries to do this with respect to our strategic assets, look out, then we'll really deal with them. So again, this myth that had kind of gotten people excused from supporting lots of groups that, as Anne-Marie detailed, have done really horrific things in Pakistan is now called into question, right? That grant of deference to the Pakistani military, which allowed them to continue supporting militant groups and kind of get away with it in some sense, is going to be much harder to maintain. The third, I think, way in which this calls into question myths that people like to tell themselves is that whatever else they are, Pakistani's civilian politicians are competent as politicians, right? So they can deliver kind of reliably for their constituents. And a colleague of mine pointed out that the Pakistani government had to know, if they didn't know where bin Laden was, that there was some probability he was going to be found in Pakistan at some point in the future, right? And so for that, they should have had a set of talking points ready, right? A competent government, anticipating what this was like, should have been out the day afterwards saying, oh, he was found in Abbottabad, okay, pull out talking point number 51.2, and everyone go on that. But they didn't. It took them 6 or 7 days to get organized around a common message, right? And that's just not consistent with kind of being competent as politicians, right? Let alone as kind of managers of some large bureaucracy. So I think all this points to great potential for change and turnover in Pakistani politics. I think another aspect of this that is particularly interesting and coming in for criticism is the notion that much of what has gone on in Pakistan that has been bad is the fault of others. And I want to read to you this line from Prime Minister Gilani's speech this morning when he took the nation into confidence and addressed the parliament. And so he's talking about how Al-Qaeda came to be in Pakistan. And he says that, in fact, the Taliban had left Kabul and taken along Al-Qaeda to their hideouts in Afghanistan. The Tora Bora bombings resulted in the dispersal of Al-Qaeda. And even at the time, we had cautioned the international forces on the consequences of a flawed military campaign, which could lead to the dispersal of Al-Qaeda. And so the narrative that he's telling in his speech to the population is basically, really, it's the U.S.'s fault that these guys are here. What's interesting is this was kind of met in lots of the Pakistani press with a great deal of derision, which seems really unusual and seems to portend kind of positive changes. So that's kind of the story with respect to Pakistan. What about with respect to Al-Qaeda? Well, what I want to say here is very brief, and it's just that for obvious reasons, this is likely to lead to much less cohesion in the organization. Right? Anyone who's in the organization is now on notice that they're vulnerable and that a huge set of documents that related and might lead to them being found was just released. So this is to the extent that the organization is still maintaining cohesion and communicating with itself is going to reduce people's willingness to do that. So what's the likely effect? And what I want to do is just caution you to be a little careful when you hear definitive statements about this. So there's this quote in Foreign Affairs Online. They have these online they have these online short posts, and one that was published on May 6th basically said, look, the killing of bin Laden is sure to increase volatility in Afghanistan and is an opportunity for jihadist organizations to remake themselves, and this decentralization will amplify the existing challenge facing U.S. counterterrorism policy. Well, yeah, maybe. But there's really no evidence, right? There's no kind of precedent for something like this that I can think of where such a central figure is removed at a point when an organization is so on the ropes. And if you go through the list of actions that Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations have taken, the really consequential ones, with probably the exception of the Madrid bombings, all had a strong central managerial role in them. And so, you know, this should make us, I think, comforted in some sense that the organization is it's unlikely to be as dangerous as it was going forward. And so I'll leave it there.
Okay. In light of the heroic events of last Sunday, I feel a little bit small-minded to turn the focus back on the domestic political implications. But that's my day job, to be a small-minded observer of American politics. So that's what I'll do. That's what I get paid for. For starters, I want to correct what a perception that many people might have if they read media reports about the public response to the successful operation in Pakistan. If you read the Washington Post today, you would have learned that there was a 10 percentage point increase in the number of Americans who approve of the president's overall handling of his job. Unfortunately, the Washington Post only takes this poll once a month, so we're comparing his poll standing on April 15th with his poll standing on May 8th. It might not be a surprise to many of you, especially those who paid taxes on April 15th, that was the low point of President Obama's popularity when he reached an all-time low of 41%. It actually started trending back upwards after the checks were mailed in, and it increased almost to 50% before last Friday. And so the difference between where he stood pre-operation and post-operation is only about 4 percentage points, which is slightly larger than the margin of error in the Gallup poll. So I believe his poll standing probably did go up, but it raises the issue of why there wasn't a bigger bounce. And so what I'll focus mostly on is kind of unpacking why I think there wasn't a bigger rally around the president, and suggest what that suggests both about the nature of American politics and the specific issues of terrorism and civil liberties. So the first and most obvious reason why there wasn't much of a jump is because the public remains very polarized on partisan grounds with respect to the president. Public approval of the president has been polarized on partisan grounds for some time, and it's at a very extreme state. Something like 83% of Democrats supported the president before the operation took place. That's a very large number, so he wasn't going to get a big bump from Democrats. The only place he could get a big bump was from Republicans, where his support stood around 8 or 9 percentage points. Okay, so almost all of the bump that he received actually came from those Republicans who now support him at somewhere between 13 and 14%. So if we expect longer-term political implications of the change, it would be that 5% of Republicans now think that he's less evil than they thought he was 2 weeks ago, and I somewhat doubt that. So just the nature of our polarized politics has meant that even very big events, like the events of last Sunday, just don't have noticeable effects. If I had a little bit more time, I was going to take all of the week-over-week changes in the Gallup poll, put them in random order, and let you pick which one involved the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden. It would be hard for you to figure it out. It was a very small bump. The second reason why there wasn't much of a bump has to do with what I call the paranoid turn in American politics. Richard Hofstadter talked about the paranoid style. It comes and goes. There's been really quite a paranoid turn. The week before the operation was spent discussing that we could finally put to rest where the president was born with the releasing of his birth certificate. So it wasn't surprising that I noticed just hours after the operation that there were already rumors about the operation being a hoax or a fake, that there were now deathers, people demanding to see death certificates for Osama bin Laden. And there's some very kind of, in a very complicated operation like the one that took place, there are lots of things that non-paranoids are going to take for granted, but that paranoids are going to see as the proof of the conspiracy. Having to burn the helicopter, having to backtrack on whether or not Osama bin Laden used his wife as a human shield, whether he was armed, why they buried him at sea, whether or not that actually conformed to Islamic law, why people were offended at the code name for the Operation Geronimo. So a lot of these things, because of the kind of paranoid nature of contemporary American politics, those became the storylines within 2 or 3 days after the attacks. Now, people may or may not believe that there was a conspiracy, but it really took away a lot of the steam from the events. And then a third point, more substantive policy point, I think, is that in light of certain ambiguities in statements and the fact that the intelligence that was used in the operation was gathered over a very long period of time across multiple administrations, it's rekindled debates about the use of enhanced interrogation and other counterterrorism intelligence gathering. Anytime you're in a very polarized partisan environment like the one we're in, ambiguity leads to division, not convergence as to what the best approach to civil liberties and interrogation and counterterrorism are. So instead of Americans rallying around the president, they may find further reasons to divide on civil liberties. I will say, however, one of the interesting things that I think may evolve over time on civil liberties is that the extreme partisan polarization on that issue may break down a little bit. After 9/11, many Republicans, including some with very strong libertarian streaks who otherwise were in no mood to give the government enhanced supervision, surveillance powers, went along with the Patriot Act for partisan reasons. Perhaps with the changing of the situation with the death of Osama bin Laden, some of those voices on the kind of libertarian right who raised the same sorts of concerns about civil liberties as the libertarian left will be heard, and perhaps there could be some substantial revisions in civil liberties policies, especially as various aspects of the Patriot Act are about to expire again. So that's something worth watching, more substantive. And finally, the reason, I think the most fundamental reason why there wasn't a big jump is that simply, unlike 2002, unlike 2004, the American voter, the American citizens, just not concerned with these issues. They were very happy to have the operation take place and to have it resolved in the way that it did. But I went to another Gallup poll that they do repeatedly, which asks Americans what the most important problem is. Should surprise no one that 26% said the economy in general, 19% said unemployment and jobs, 17% said the federal deficit. Maybe a little surprising that 1% said terrorism. About the same amount has said the lack of respect for other people. So terrorism just simply is not rating on people's, these were polls from mid-April, it just simply before the operation, terrorism was not ranking as a very important issue. So it's hard to see how the president gets a lot of political credit for resolving an issue which portends to play very little role in the next election. One of the things that we'll do is it will, I think, increase pressure to kind of conjoin the issues of the ultimate demise of Osama bin Laden in the economy and jobs. And I think that'll come in the form of demands for some sort of peace dividend, like we saw at the end of the Cold War. Of course, the difficulty here, it was alluded to by Dean Slaughter and also by Professor Shapiro, was that we really can't raise expectations too high. This is not like the end of the Cold War, where there are really tangible savings that can take place right away and have those resources deployed to reducing the deficit or to domestic social programs. Perhaps it will ultimately mean some sort of drawdown, quicker drawdown in the Middle East, but the administration can't afford to take too much credit for raising expectations high because they still have some foreign policy goals in the region that they will have to address. So, you know, I can't get out of this segment without talking about the 2012 elections. My sense is that the president's in a better position because this happened than if it had not happened. Yet I think because the fundamental issue that American voters worry about is economics, unemployment, the deficit, and not terrorism, that the effects will be rather small.
Hello, my name is Cady. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel obligated to say, since I'm active duty military, that the opinions that I'm about to express are mine and mine alone, and do not reflect the government or the Navy in general. Nor will I try to put this in context of the Arab Spring and some of the amazing events. Clearly, some of my illustrious panelists have far more experience than I do. Has done an excellent job of doing that. Not to mention, I happen to be in Jake's class. And that was one of the final questions, which he hasn't graded yet, so I wouldn't want him to judge me hastily there. You know, as we move from the domestic politics, where you know, terrorism might not be the most popular key aspect of what's going on, I can say it's incredibly important to us, and that actually represents an achievement of sorts in ours, that you don't have to worry so much about that. So I would like to say that on behalf of the SEALs and Naval Special Warfare, it's an honor and a privilege to perform this kind of service for everybody. And it's something that we're extraordinarily proud of. So I think probably what you most want to know about what's happened is kind of people that do this sort of thing, and sort of the decisions that went into it, and how we might go about doing this in the future. I can say that I felt extraordinarily lucky this past year to attend school at Princeton. Pretty amazing place, some certainly very intelligent people. But I can say after the events of last week, I kind of felt the tables were turned a little bit, and I absolutely wish that I'd been there. I can tell you that my wife here, my young son, the 10-month-old over there making some noise, I probably don't believe that. But I'm certainly representative of a fair amount of the Special Forces, generally a little bit older. I won't say nominally more mature, but we certainly make the attempt at it and put a veneer of professionalism that we strive to achieve in everything that we do. Typically, we start you know, training in something that is known as BUDS, or Basic Underwater Demolition / SEAL training, which is 8 months of selection, generally aimed to weed out people who don't have the mental fortitude or strength to continue on and persevere throughout all kinds of different things. Of course, that's just the beginning. You spend another couple of years doing individual training, learning how to jump out of airplanes, you know, sort of things exciting that seem exciting at the time. But generally what we do is actually much more mundane and much more difficult on a daily basis. Certainly the events on the nighttime raid to get bin Laden was, you know, kind of the height of what we train to do, and absolutely, you know, what we strive to achieve for our nation. But simultaneously, in the context of Anne-Marie's comments, you know, we're actually doing counterinsurgency operations at the same time as we are counter-terrorist operations in pursuit of Taliban senior leadership or Al-Qaeda senior leadership. So while we have groups of people that are chasing some of these terrorist leaders, at the same time we have small groups of teams that are out engaging with villagers, you know, talking with local sheikhs. As a mere example of that, I mean, in my personal career, you know, in 2004, I protected the vice president of Iraq while he was in interim stage, Dr. Ibrahim Jaffrey. Later, I was engaged in full spectrum operations in Anbar province throughout the tribal awakening. So two very, very different you know, missions, and which is clearly, yet again, different from this sort of like nighttime raid that you see that got bin Laden. And so, you know, we sort of train to do those things all of the time, and so do a lot of other people in the military. I'd like to say, too, that this achievement is really representative of thousands of people who've, you know, the unsung heroes that have participated in either gathering, organizing the information, drawing small little strands together to produce just enough information to give the president a chance to decide whether or not this was going to be a risk versus reward situation. It's almost the culmination of events over the last, 30 years since the Iran hostage affair, where special forces and various different groups kind of failed to protect the American people for a lot of reasons. And some of the things that they did in response to that was to reorganize how special operations were and how the military worked in general. And so I think last week's operation really represents the culmination of years of effort and training and learning. While a lot of time goes into deciding like what strategy needs to be used when, we need to be able to do all of those sort of simultaneously and pick and choose which one needs to be used at the right moment. And one of the ways that we do that, which I think is a lot of people can see would appreciate in Princeton, is this sort of like multidisciplinary expertise that we've gathered together over a lot of years of learning. I think even 10 years ago, at the beginning, right after 9/11, I don't think that the cooperation between civilian and military professionals was anywhere near what it is today, and the capacity of what we can do is a product of a huge learning curve that simply wouldn't have been possible had we not had the incredible experiences that we see. And you see that reflected in all kinds of different and small little ways, whether it's military professionals joining the State Department, or the civilian surge, helping us work out what the best form of communicating to the people are, or even academic and think tank contributions to the strategy and political situations out over in the Middle East. So what you see is the collection of a lot of different efforts going in, and I think that everybody should really take a step back and sort of appreciate how far we've come, and then how amazing it is to be an American at this time. When you look at things like nighttime raids, and you saw a lot of coverage over, the risk of the operation and the incredible decision, that the president, deserves credit for. These are the kind of things that we do relatively on a nightly basis. Some might be wondering what the heck SEALs are doing way out in the middle of Afghanistan, certainly not very close to the water. But actually, they're part of we're part of a group that has been targeting senior terrorist leadership for the last 10 years. And so what's been happening throughout that time is we've been drawing in experts, from the technology sector, from the intelligence sectors, from various and sundry parts of the government, and consistently developing new techniques to handle, to put the kind of pressure on these organizations that make them make mistakes, that provide opportunities for us to set the conditions for things like the Arab Spring and the more important political resolution that will actually resolve the situation. I think it's incredibly important to note that the discussions on his impact, the death of bin Laden on the organization, is incredibly pertinent. I think one of the things that we found out tactically over the last 10 years is that when you're able to deny the enemy safe haven, when you're able to take out senior leaders who might have a large impact, those organizations tend to make mistakes. They tend to go to ground. They tend to not be able to conduct attacks in the near future. And this represents a double opportunity, because I can assure you that the team guys and the professionals as part of the command that do this are certainly not resting on their laurels. In fact, they're absolutely exploiting the information that came off these targets, and probably trying to include the information from thousands of informants that are a large part of our vast network that now includes the AFPAC border region. So I think that when you put all of these things in perspective, was this an amazing, unique operation? Absolutely. Is it going to be the last one? It's unlikely to be the case. I mean, clearly there are other leaders within the terrorist organizations. Al-Qaeda is not the only terrorist organization out there. And I think that debates over whether or not we should be doing counterterrorism or counterinsurgency is actually somewhat misguided. These are all tools that go in the tool bag that you need to pull out on a basis, depending on what the situation presents and why you might do that kind of a thing. I think in closing, it's been an amazing time here at Princeton, that it's allowed me to sort of put in perspective the achievement of so many people. and that's a vote of confidence from my boy there. To put in perspective the achievement of so many people over the last 10 years, whether they're from the Bush administration or the Obama administration, it really doesn't matter to us out there, and we're proud to be on the front lines, and we'll continue to do so. Thank you.
So we'd like to take questions now and ask that you come to the microphones up front. And we do ask that students be given a chance to ask questions first. It's amazing that you guys are here, given that it's exam week. So come on down. They're too tired to ask questions. Yeah.
Just a side question to the commander. You don't know the man who shot bin Laden, do you? Just thought I'd ask.
Unfortunately, I don't know his personal name. I'm sure that I do know him, though.
Well, give him a beer. But no, anyway, just two quick questions. One, given you say the degrading of Al-Qaeda, do you think we're more likely on the United States homeland to see more rogue, unsophisticated solo terrorists using handguns to do terrorist actions? And the second one, do you think the Obama administration is going to step up the drone attacks in the Arab Peninsula? And I'll sit down.
So presumably you mean in Saudi Arabia and Yemen?
Yemen.
So I have no idea on the second question. That's kind of a fairly high-level policy decision. On the first question, which was why should we expect to see more terrorist attacks with handguns, it's kind of a puzzle that there hasn't been more of that, right? In the sense that, in most any state in the nation on any given Saturday, you can walk into a gun show, buy a weapon and a bunch of ammunition and a bunch of high-capacity magazines, pop out this particular piece in the weapon, and then you have a fully automatic weapon that, kind of once you start shooting, it's just going to keep shooting, and you can go through a clip and kill lots of people that way. It hasn't happened by kind of foreign terrorist groups in the United States, which is a bit of a puzzle. And, I suspect the reason why is that it's not particularly politically useful, right? It doesn't kind of fit into this narrative, and it's not, I don't know, it's not the style almost, right? And so I suspect, given that that hasn't been a mode of attack that people have used, it's fairly unlikely to become one. Maybe, but it just doesn't, for whatever reason, whatever the reasons are, it hasn't been chosen. This doesn't seem like anything that would change that.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us today. My question is specifically to Professor Shapiro, or addressing something that you said in the first half of your talk. You basically laid out the competency level of the Pakistani government, or lack thereof, and then went on to say very briefly that this opens up the opportunity for change within the government structure and politicians. I was wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit more, particularly given something that Professor Slaughter said about the lack of kind of an educated and young populace within that particular country. I'm just wondering what kind of mechanisms would incentivize people to, I guess, force change within the government and political structure.
So I should be clear. I don't think I was suggesting that there would, or I didn't mean to suggest that there would be kind of large changes in the political structure of Pakistan. I think the politics around supporting and tolerating the presence of militant groups is changed a lot. So for a number of years, these groups have been kind of tolerated by the government in ways that almost everyone kind of acknowledges, right, and understands that there's a range of groups that are doing things against India and Kashmir and might be useful in Afghanistan in the future, and that there's some cost we have to pay as a state for tolerating their presence. But trust us, because we're confident at managing your security, that it's worth it. Right? That's kind of been the narrative. That narrative becomes now very hard to sustain. And in the past, particularly in the spring of 2009, when the politics around supporting militancy in Pakistan change, the Pakistani state can turn on a dime. Right? So in April of 2009, they negotiated a truce with certain elements of the Pakistani Taliban that basically ceded governance of two provinces near Islamabad, Swat and Malakand, to them. And a number of things transpired shortly after the peace deal was happened that dramatically changed the politics of it within the rest of Pakistan. In particular, this cell phone video of the Pakistani Taliban whipping a 16-year-old girl in a public square went viral. And all of a sudden, it became kind of very politically advantageous to go after them. And the Pakistani army almost immediately engaged in a massive offensive that drove the Pakistan Taliban not only out of Swat and Malakand, but out of several of the tribal areas, these kind of very mountainous, difficult to control areas of Pakistan. That happened in a matter of weeks, right? And it was because of this political change. So if this generates a similar change in the politics in Pakistan, we could see big changes in their policy towards the Taliban very quickly.
Okay. Thank you.
I'd just add that, again, the Pakistani politics has been a steady back and forth between the military and civilian governments, and the military governments have been successful much more of the time. And indeed, for much of the past year, there have been steady predictions that Zardari was going down, that the military was going to take over. Now, that hasn't happened. That's the first thing to point out. Second, right before Osama bin Laden was killed, you saw a coalition between Zardari and Nawaz Sharif, his chief civilian opponent, which is also important in terms of stabilizing the civilian government. And today what you saw was Gilani essentially taking the side of the military. I mean, and rather than pointing his finger at the military, he was defending them. And the best analysis I've read suggests, he's buying himself some slack so that this actually strengthens the civilian hand against the military in ways that, again, I think are good for us.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, Jake, this will give me the chance to see how you're going to grade my essay as well. But I would take it from your course that one way of analyzing Osama's death on terrorism is to sort of think about the evolution of jihadist terrorism. This evolution of away from terrorism being conducted by individuals that were sort of former mujahideen fighting against the Soviets, for example, in Afghanistan, and toward more homegrown terrorism undertaken by children of Muslim immigrants and so on to the West. So my question is, or my sense is perhaps that his death has the effect is one of sort of how do children of these immigrants sort of interpret the death? Are they inspired by it? Do they see it as this are they inspired by this idea that he goes down to special forces, or instead are they sort of demoralized, seeing sort of this otherwise superhero figure now perished? So I wonder if you would agree with that analysis.
Definitely an A. But you don't get points for questions. So I think it's a great question. I have no idea how this will play in that population. I think what's important to keep in mind is that population has not been very successful, right? So almost all the plots that are kind of generated by people with no military experience and no kind of formal training in making explosives, planning them, the tradecraft of going undetected by the state authorities, almost none of those attacks have succeeded, right? They end up either the bombs don't go off, they're captured, or they have kind of laughable ideas about how you could do attacks. My favorite example is there's the guy who planned to blow up the fuel farm at JFK Airport by exploding a valve that was several miles from the airport, and apparently they hadn't covered the combustion requires fuel and oxygen part of the course for him, because his view was that he would blow this thing up and the fire would travel down the pipeline and blow up the fuel farm. So that's the kind of skill level you get from the genuine homegrown terrorist. And that's something that I think we as a society should be willing to live with.
Great. Thank you for speaking with us today. My question is just open to the panel, but it's addressing the aspects of the legal issues with killing Osama bin Laden in Pakistani territory. I've seen a lot of speculation in the media about whether or not this action was legal in terms of international law. And I was just wondering what you think will be the ramifications. Will the Pakistani government address this issue in a legal court? Will somebody speak out on Pakistan's behalf, or will this issue just kind of subside and not enter the international legal structure at all?
I guess I'm the international lawyer on the panel. Everybody's looking at me. So there are a couple different ways to think about it. The first is in terms of, were we offending Pakistan? No. I mean, we in the first place, as the Pakistanis themselves have pointed out, we could never have done this without active cooperation from Pakistan, whether or not it was, they were allowing our helicopters in at the attack. They were giving visas to our CIA folks who were there. They were feeding us some information. So this is not in any way illegal with respect to our intervention in Pakistan. So that from that point of view. The second question is, in terms of the law of war, was it legal to kill Osama bin Laden? And there you can argue, but I've looked at the arguments that are coming out from legal scholars, and even legal scholars who would, I think, normally be inclined to draw a very hard line, think that it was perfectly reasonable to go in to try to capture him, but in a situation, do we know if he was armed? It was dark. You were in a compound. He retreated into a room. You had no idea what he was grabbing at that point. To shoot him was not against the law. Now, if you'd known, if you had evidence that said, we're going to go in to shoot him, that makes it a little more complicated, but he is not a head of state. This is not the normal law of war where you don't assassinate the head of the other army. He's the head of a terrorist group. So there too, I think this is legal, and I actually think we are moving toward a greater individualization of targets, and that is actually a good thing overall. It's not, you don't want to license assassinating heads of state, but you do want to be able to target the actual person rather than blowing up, his compound, part of the town, and killing lots of civilians.
Yeah, one of the things I'll add to that too is that it kind of points out the difference between putting people on the ground and using like airstrikes or drone strikes and things like that. And it's kind of sad in a way because one of the useful things about having people like us on the ground is that we do have the ability to surgically decide what's the right thing to do. You have people or human beings with training that can make that decision. When you're looking at through a camera or a video on the screen and making those decisions, there's a lot more mistakes that can be made, and you see those things all over Afghanistan, which is part of the reason they started limiting airstrikes in the first place. So while putting troops on the ground to do these kind of operations certainly seems to open up a little bit of a legal bag, I can assure you from like the rules on the engagement side, the guys who go in to do that are definitely trained to discriminate their use of force. Additionally, the goal would definitely have been to capture bin Laden rather than kill him for a lot of reasons. Number one is the intelligence that could follow on, and it would be a much bigger blow to his organization if we were able to get some of that info off him. So while we don't actually know what transpired in the room, for sure the actions that he chose to take determined what happened.
I'm going to follow up on the same thing, and this for Professor Slaughter. In the past, a lot of officials from the European Union have condemned targeted assassination that Israelis have been engaging in with respect to Hamas leaders. how much do you think, how much do you think is there a difference between the targeted assassination that we were just talking about and assassinating Hamas leaders, first of all? And how much do you think there is the success of this whole operation is going to embolden Israel, Russia, or Iran, or even Turkey in specifically assassinating the terrorist forces that are at war with them?
So I think, this is a very complicated area. That's why I started by saying the orders, as far as we know, were to capture. And that, as Kevin points out, the killing reflected what happened on the ground rather than what they were told to go in to do. And I think that is also backed up by the fact that we sent in troops rather than, obviously a drone attack, given our technology, could have done that. So with respect to that question, I think it's legal. Would it have been legal if it had been kill him? And how different is that? So the first thing you'd have to say is he declared war on the United States. We have been pursuing him for 10 years, and in the context of a military action, and in an ongoing military action. And I think there's an argument in that context that seeking to kill him could be legal. The danger is exactly what, this is not a settled area of the law for all the reasons you said. The danger is precisely that once you start licensing assassinations per se with any kind of technology, and particularly remote technology, the risks of not only killing innocent people, but simply killing people without any demonstration that these are, in fact, the people who are guilty in some way is much, much higher. So I have not supported targeted assassinations overall. On the other hand, so I don't have a firm view. On the other hand, I do think it is better to be able to go after an individual than it is to essentially obliterate a village or a compound as you would do in traditional warfare. In terms of emboldening others, in my sense, the Russians are certainly killing whoever they can find in Chechnya. I don't know that it's going to make a big difference in terms of governments who have been pursuing these kinds of tactics against terrorist organizations.
Well, what Israel? In the past, Israel was criticized heavily by the EU. Do you think the EU is going to be able to criticize Israel as much after they were completely silent about bin Laden?
I think these judgments are not just about the means, but about larger issues.
I think mine's.
All right. This might be not exactly on topic with the panel, but one thing Professor Slaughter brought up was the sort of the beginning of the Arab Spring and how that's sort of the next step in this story, I guess. And one thing that has been a concern ever since, Tunisia has been the idea that in whatever vacuum there is, Islamic fundamentalism will come in to have some sort of influence on what happens and the developments that happen in the Arab countries. And I was wondering what your take was on that issue.
Well, I think that the United States is known for some time, and again, both administrations, whether it was the Bush administration or the Obama administration, that this imposed stability imposed by governments that were maintaining their power by force and by brutality against any political opposition couldn't last. We had made that bargain precisely because the argument on the other side was if it's not us, then it is a version of Al-Qaeda. And we were not willing to test that. And in the one case we were willing to test that, where we really pushed very hard, you got the election of Hamas in Gaza, and that certainly strengthened the other side. But we knew it couldn't last. Again, the number of papers that were written first when Condoleezza Rice went to Egypt and went to Cairo and said, you really, the freedom agenda is not just about Iraq. This is across the Middle East. Now, she got pushed back, but then Barack Obama goes to Cairo and says the same thing. So I think we've recognized that you had to find a better way. And the better way is to distinguish between religious parties of any religion who are willing to participate in a peaceful political process and those who are not. And rather than drawing the line in terms of an Islamic party or not, you make that distinction. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has said, you know, they want to participate in the political process, and we need to take them at their word. So I'm not, we shouldn't be at all surprised that there are going to be gains of those parties. There are going to be a range of new actors in politics, but longer term, we are far better off engaging different groups on their own terms than we are drawing a line between a dictator who's in our camp and the threat of something like Al-Qaeda on the other side.
So I can speak to this a little bit just in the Pakistani context, in the sense that there's a lot of kind of concern expressed periodically about the possibility that you would have some kind of Islamist government come to power there, and that would be really bad. And what's interesting from the perspective of evaluating claims people make about this is how out of whack with reality lots of those concerns are in that context. Right? So the one time kind of the Islamist parties, political parties have done well in Pakistan was in the 2002 elections in the Northwest Frontier Province, the area bordering the tribal areas where we've been doing the drone attacks and where lots of the terrorist activity originates from. And so in 2002, the secular nationalist Pashtun party, which had dominated that province, was swept out of office and replaced by an Islamist party. And people got very nervous in Washington. And there was lots of stuff written about, oh, how terrible this was going to be, and this was going to be a big problem for Pakistan. And in the next election, all those people who won were then swept out of office and replaced by the secular nationalists. And it turns out that the story seems to be that shortly before the election, a law was passed which required people standing for parliament to have college degrees. And none of the Awami National Party politicians had college degrees. And so most of the prominent people couldn't run. And that's why the Islamists did so well in 2002. And so then when they're able to run again, they swept the Islamists out of power. So, you know, it's not...
it's not as big an issue as...
But what's so probative, I think, about this for the other countries is just the gap between the fear that's raised in discussions in D.C. and kind of the reality on the ground in that country in particular.
Great, thank you.
We have a little bit more time, so we can open it up to the general audience if you've got questions. Can you come down and look?
I'd like the panel to give me a yes, no, or maybe on the, will the Americans be able to gain access to the people who are in the compound who are now in Pakistani care?
My answer is we aren't going to know whether we are gaining access to them. In other words, we may well be, but it's not, it is certainly not in the Pakistani government's interest to make that public. But Jake, this is your world more than mine.
I think that's right. I mean, kind of the move here for the Pakistani government is to quietly give the U.S. access.
It'll be on the sly.
Yeah.
Completely.
I'd like to hear from Lieutenant Commander.
Yeah, I would have to argue that. I have no friggin' idea.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you.
I have the obligatory India angle question on this. It's one thing, at least from the Indian perspective, is that U.S. is far too willing to believe either deliberately or for public consumption, that somehow there is this secularist, cigar-chomping generals in Pakistan who are somehow cozy with U.S. In terms of promoting the U.S. agenda. But there seems to be no willingness to consider the other angle that Pakistan is actually playing a duplicitous game, fully aware that they could be extracting aid to the tune of $20 billion since September 11, using this as a ruse, using terrorism as a ruse. So the question is, why and what is it that causes US to take this view of believing in Pakistan's innate good nature to support its agenda?
I'm glad you asked that question as a final question, because I'm going to have to disagree with it pretty profoundly. I don't think that's right. Indeed, I don't think there's anybody in Washington that doesn't think that there are many elements in Pakistan who do not share our agenda. I think this has made that unquestionably clear to the larger public, but it wasn't a surprise to anybody that I worked with in government. However, that shouldn't completely get India off the hook. I actually think what we're seeing here is this swing back and forth between, right now, there's a tremendous amount of demonization of Pakistan. You know, look at the Pakistanis, we're giving them all this money. They're clearly playing a double game. As I said, there's no one Pakistan here. There is also, though, legitimate Pakistani security concerns with respect to Kashmir, with respect to their history. I mean, Americans have a hard time remembering how recent that history is. Ultimately, I don't think we can possibly solve this without Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan all working on the complex of issues. Because Pakistan sees India working in Afghanistan, there's a lot of paranoia there. There's a very negative scenario in which Pakistan goes closer and closer to China. India and Afghanistan and the US are on the other side. That's not a good scenario for anybody. The better scenario is that India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan together have resources and trade routes that are in tremendous demand by the Chinese and by the Indians, for that matter. There's a very positive set of economic possibilities. If you just look at the demand for resources, for minerals and other resources that India and China together need, it is the equivalent of building a large US city sort of on a monthly basis. Afghanistan's got a lot of that. Pakistan's got some. The trade routes are traditional. So the far better solution is actually to try to get all three countries to stop pointing fingers at each other. I understand it's hard, but there are real economic incentives to do this. And I'm not saying you have to solve Kashmir, because I think that's asking for a lot, but you do have to I don't think you can just do it with two of the three. I don't think you can just do it with Pakistan and Afghanistan, or just Pakistan or India, or just Afghanistan and India. You have to have all three, and you have to have a pretty balanced view of all three countries.
Can I have a follow-up? Sorry. In terms of, if you were Kayani today or Pasha today, you have to be wondering how you gain back some level of semblance of credibility for yourself and your establishments in Pakistan today. So what I fear most is, what they would do. And specifically, the soft belly in this whole scenario is the Azad Kashmir. And they could very well be fomenting trouble in that area in order to gain some credence for themselves with the Pakistani population. Would you comment on that? Would you think that assessment would be far off the mark?
I don't think that's an impossible assessment. I think it's all the more reason to seize what I do think is a moment of political possibility and try to convert it to a positive settlement, rather than letting the different elements decide to try to recover on their own.
Okay, so let's thank our panel very much, and thank